It was a bone-chilling winter night when Officer James got the call that would change his life forever. The dispatch crackled through his radio at 2:47 a.m., pulling him away from his routine patrol of the quiet suburban streets. Unit 4B, Pine Grove Apartments. Neighbors reporting strange noises. Possible welfare check needed. James had handled countless welfare checks before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher described the sounds, scratching, thumping, and what sounded like faint crying. Or perhaps it was because he knew the building well. It was home to many elderly residents who lived alone. The drive to Pine Grove was eerily quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty sidewalks as his patrol car cruised through the sleeping town. His mind wandered to Mrs. Henderson, the tenant in 4B. She was a gentle soul who always waved to him during his patrols, sometimes offering him homemade cookies when he helped her with her groceries. Pulling into the apartment complex parking lot, James noticed all the windows were dark except for a flickering hallway light on the 4th floor. The night air bit at his face as he stepped out of his warm car. His footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell. The elevator was out of service again. Reaching the 4th floor, his flashlight beam cut through the dim hallway. Outside Unit 4B, a week's worth of newspapers lay untouched, their headlines yellowing with age. His knock echoed down the corridor. "Police? Mrs. Henderson, are you there?" Silence answered back, broken only by a faint scratching sound from inside. The sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. There was something almost desperate about it. Using his radio, he called for backup and contacted the building manager for the master key. Protocol demanded he wait, but those strange sounds and his gut feeling urged him to act quickly. The manager arrived within minutes, out of breath and still in his pajamas. As the door swung open, the musty smell of an unopened apartment hit them. James's flashlight revealed a living room frozen in time, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, a cold cup of tea beside it. Everything was eerily neat, unlike what you'd expect in a break-in. The scratching grew louder as he approached the bedroom. His hand rested on his holster. Years of experience had taught him to be prepared for anything. But nothing in his training could have prepared him for what he found when he pushed open that door. Mrs. Henderson lay on the floor beside her bed, conscious but barely able to move. Next to her was Max, her orange tabby cat, whose paws were raw from days of scratching at the walls and floor. The scene before him told a story of survival and devotion that would stick with him forever. The cat had been trying to get help for his owner, who had suffered a stroke while getting ready for bed. Unable to reach her phone or call for help, Mrs. Henderson had been kept alive by Max's dedication. Food bowls in the corner showed how the cat had shared his remaining kibble with her, dropping pieces near her mouth. "It's okay now, Mrs. Henderson," James said softly, kneeling beside her as he radioed for immediate medical assistance. "Help is here." Tears welled up in his eyes as Max rubbed against him, purring for the first time since he entered. The cat's mission was finally complete. He had succeeded in getting someone's attention. As paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, James picked up Max, noticing how light he had become. The cat had lost weight staying by his owner's side, refusing to abandon her even as his own food ran out. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes heroes come in unexpected forms. The darkness at the hospital seemed different than the one Officer James had left behind at Pine Grove Apartments. Here, it was alive with the quiet bustle of the night shift, nurses making their rounds, monitors beeping steadily, and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors. James sat in the waiting room, still in uniform, with Max curled up in a carrier beside him. He couldn't bring himself to leave, not until he knew Mrs. Henderson would be okay. The events of the night kept playing through his mind like a movie he couldn't pause. The paramedics had worked quickly, their practiced movements betraying the urgency of the situation. They talked in medical terms that flew over James's head, but he caught enough to understand that every minute had counted. If they'd arrived even a day later, he pushed the thought away. A young doctor appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Her tired eyes softened when she saw Max's carrier. Word of the cat's heroics had already spread through the emergency department. "Officer," she said, pulling up a chair, "Mrs. Henderson is stable. The stroke affected her left side, but she's responding well to treatment. She's asking about her cat." James felt something loosen in his chest. a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He looked down at Max, who had somehow dozed off despite the unfamiliar surroundings. The cat's orange fur was matted, and his paws still showed signs of his desperate attempts to get help. With permission from the medical staff, James carried Max's carrier to Mrs. Henderson's room. The sight of her in the hospital bed, connected to monitors and IVs, made his throat tight. But when she turned her head and saw them, her face lit up with a smile that erased decades from her features. "My brave boy," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. James carefully let Max out of the carrier, and the cat immediately curled up in the small space beside her pillow, purring loud enough to compete with the medical equipment. As James watched them reunite, he thought about all the times he'd passed their apartment during his patrols. He remembered how Mrs. Henderson would sometimes sit by her window in the evenings, Max always nearby. He'd thought of them as just another resident and her pet, but now he understood he'd been seeing something much deeper, a connection that had ultimately saved a life. The night shift nurses brought Mrs. Henderson some water, and one of them slipped Max a few treats they'd gotten from the children's ward. James noticed how they lingered in the room longer than necessary, drawn in by the palpable bond between the elderly woman and her cat. Before leaving, James promised to check on their apartment and feed Max while Mrs. Henderson recovered. As he turned to go, she caught his hand with her good one. "Thank you," she said, her eyes bright with tears, "for listening to him when no one else would." Walking back to his patrol car as dawn broke over the city, James thought about all the calls he'd responded to over the years. Some had been dramatic, others routine, but none had affected him quite like this one. It wasn't just about saving a life, it was about witnessing the extraordinary lengths love could go to. He made a mental note to stop by the pet store before his shift ended. Max deserved the finest cat food they had, and maybe a new toy or two. After all, it wasn't every day you met a hero who walked on four paws. The next few weeks brought changes to Pine Grove Apartments that nobody could have predicted. The story of Mrs. Henderson and Max had spread through the building like wildfire, turning their quiet fourth-floor hallway into something of a community gathering spot. Officer James kept his promise, checking on the apartment daily. Each visit revealed new surprises. Handwritten notes slipped under the door, fresh flowers in small vases, and even home-cooked meals left by neighbors who'd lived beside Mrs. Henderson for years but had barely spoken to her before. The building manager, who'd always enforced a strict no-pets policy, found himself softening. He'd catch himself buying cat treats to keep in his office, claiming they were just in case, but really hoping Max would stop by during his daily walks through the building with James. One particularly memorable evening, James arrived to find an elderly gentleman from 2A installing a small cat door in Mrs. Henderson's apartment. The man, a retired carpenter, had gotten special permission from the manager. "So Max can always get help if he needs to," he explained, his weathered hands carefully measuring the space. The local news caught wind of the story, but James was protective of Mrs. Henderson's privacy. He did, however, share one detail that stuck with people: how Max had rationed his own food to share with his owner. The pet store owner downtown put the story up on his wall, and soon people were paying for food and supplies for other elderly residents' pets. At the hospital, Mrs. Henderson was making progress that surprised even her doctors. The physiotherapist said she'd never seen someone so determined to recover. "I have to get back to my boy," Mrs. Henderson would say during particularly challenging sessions, her voice steady despite the effort. James brought Max to visit every few days, carefully carrying him in the new plush carrier donated by a pet shop owner who'd read about their story. The nurses would gather to watch their reunions, touched by how the cat would gently nuzzle Mrs. Henderson's hand, careful to avoid the IV tubes. During one visit, Mrs. Henderson shared something that made James's heart skip a beat. She told him how, in those dark days when she lay helpless on her bedroom floor, it wasn't just Max's physical presence that kept her going. The cat would meow conversations with her, as if telling her stories to keep her mind off their situation. "He looked me right in the eyes," she said, stroking Max's fur with her good hand, "and I swear he was promising me everything would be okay." Somehow, I believed him. The cat purred loudly, as if confirming her words. The hospital staff began using their story to help other patients. When someone felt like giving up during therapy, they'd tell them about Mrs. Henderson and her guardian angel cat. Somehow, knowing that such pure love existed made people try a little harder, push a little further. James found himself changed by the experience too. He started carrying a few cat treats in his patrol car, just in case. His fellow officers teased him at first, until they saw how often those treats helped him connect with scared pets at accident scenes or during welfare checks. The precinct's annual community service report that year included a special section about animal companions and elderly residents. James's story, carefully anonymous to protect Mrs. Henderson's privacy, became a teaching tool for new officers. Sometimes, they learned, the most important clues don't come from people at all. The day Mrs. Henderson returned home transformed Pine Grove Apartments. Officer James arrived early that morning to find the hallway decorated with welcome home signs, their edges adorned with paw print stickers lovingly added by the building manager's young daughter. The physical therapist had worked out a detailed home care plan, but it was Max who seemed to understand his role best. The cat had developed an uncanny sense for when Mrs. Henderson needed support. When she practiced walking with her cane, Max would pace beside her, providing a furry guide rail whenever she wobbled. The apartment had changed too. Neighbors had pitched in to rearrange furniture, creating wider paths for her walker. The retired carpenter from 2A had built custom ramps over small ledges and thresholds. Even the bathroom had been fitted with new safety rails, though the installation crew spent more time petting Max than working. James noticed something else during his regular visits, the way other residents now stopped by just to chat. Mrs. Thompson from 4A brought her knitting, working on scarves while sharing neighborhood news. The quiet college student from 4C started doing his readings in Mrs. Henderson's living room, claiming the gentle sound of Max purring helped him concentrate. The most touching moments came during Mrs. Henderson's therapy exercises. When she felt frustrated by her slow progress, Max would bring her his favorite toy mouse, dropping it at her feet. It became a game. She'd try to walk a little further each time to retrieve it, while Max watched with encouraging chirps. One afternoon, James arrived to find Mrs. Henderson in tears. His heart jumped until he realized they were happy tears. She'd managed to prepare a cup of tea entirely on her own, something that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Max sat on the counter beside the kettle, looking as proud as any nurse or doctor. The building's dynamics shifted permanently. Other residents started leaving their doors cracked open during the day, a practice Mrs. Henderson had always followed to let Max visit neighbors. The hallways, once silent, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter. Someone even started a weekly coffee morning in the common room. James watched as Max adapted to his new role as building celebrity. The cat developed a routine of morning rounds, checking on elderly residents with the seriousness of a doctor on hospital rounds. He seemed to know which doors to scratch at, which residents needed a friendly visitor that day. The local senior center took notice. They started a program matching elderly residents with shelter cats, carefully considering personalities and needs. James often thought about how one cat's devotion had sparked a movement that was changing lives across the community. Mrs. Henderson's recovery continued to amaze everyone. Her doctors attributed it to her determination, but those who spent time in apartment 4B knew better. They saw how Max celebrated each small victory. A steadier step, a stronger grip, with happy purrs and gentle headbutts. During quiet moments, when James stopped by after his shift, Mrs. Henderson would sometimes talk about those 3 days on the floor. "I was never alone," she'd say, scratching Max behind his ears. "Every time I opened my eyes, he was there, telling me to hold on just a little longer." The story could have ended sadly, James realized. It could have been just another tragedy, another reminder of how isolated people can become. Instead, it had become a testament to love's power to heal, to build bridges, and to remind everyone that sometimes the strongest hearts beat on 4 paws. 6 months after that life-changing night, Pine Grove Apartments hosted its first annual Pet Appreciation Day. The courtyard buzzed with activity as residents and their furry companions gathered to celebrate the bonds that had grown stronger with each passing week. Mrs. Henderson sat in a comfortable chair near the refreshment table, Max lounging regally on her lap. Her recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. Though she still used a cane, her movements were steady and sure. The weekly therapy sessions had done wonders, but everyone knew it was Max's unwavering support that made the real difference. Officer James, off-duty but still wearing his signature kind smile, watched as children from the building took turns presenting Max with homemade toys and treats. The cat accepted each gift with dignified grace, giving each child a gentle headbutt of appreciation that made them giggle with delight. The building manager had turned one corner of the courtyard into a makeshift stage. He shared how the no pets policy had officially changed to pets welcome, earning a round of applause that made Max's ears twitch. More than half the residents now had animal companions, many adopted from the local shelter's new Senior Buddies program. A quiet elderly man who'd recently moved into 3C stood up to speak. His voice trembled as he described how lonely he'd felt after losing his wife last year. Then he met Max during one of the cat's daily rounds, and something changed. Now he had his own cat, a gentle gray tabby who helped him remember that life still held joy. The local vet had set up a small booth offering free checkups. When Max hopped up on the examination table for his turn, the vet revealed something that brought tears to Mrs. Henderson's eyes. The scratch marks on the walls hadn't just been random. Max had been trying to trace the shape of letters, attempting to literally write for help. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, residents shared stories of how their lives had changed. The college student from 4C had switched his major to veterinary medicine. The carpenter from 2A now spent his free time building cat furniture for shelter animals. Even the grumpy man from 1B had softened, often seen sharing his morning paper with a rescued orange cat that looked just like Max. Mrs. Henderson's physical therapist stopped by, bringing news that made everyone cheer. The hospital was starting a pet therapy program, inspired by how Max's visits had helped not just his owner, but other patients too. They'd already seen remarkable results, especially with stroke recovery patients. James couldn't help but marvel at how one cat's devotion had created ripples that kept spreading. The police department had updated its welfare check protocols, making sure officers paid special attention to signs from pets. 3 lives had already been saved because officers noticed unusual pet behavior. As evening approached, someone started playing soft music. Mrs. Henderson rose from her chair, steady on her feet, and gave Max a gentle hug. "My little guardian angel," she whispered, but in the quiet courtyard, everyone heard. There wasn't a dry eye to be found. The stars were just beginning to appear when James headed home that night. He thought about how close this story had come to having a different ending. One ignored call, a few more hours of delay, and everything would have been different. Instead, a community had been transformed, all because of a cat who refused to give up on the person he loved. Looking back at the lit windows of Pine Grove Apartments, James saw silhouettes of people and pets sharing their evening routines. Each window told a story of companionship, of lives made fuller by the simple presence of an animal friend. And it all started because a cat named Max knew exactly what his person needed and wouldn't rest until she got it. A year had passed since that fateful night at Pine Grove Apartments. Officer James now found himself standing in front of a room full of fellow police officers, sharing a story that had changed not just his life, but an entire community's approach to emergency response. The department's training room was packed. Officers from neighboring districts had come to learn about the new Pet Alert program that James had helped develop. On the screen behind him, a photo of Max and Mrs. Henderson smiled at the audience, a reminder that sometimes the smallest heroes make the biggest difference. Before this happened, James explained, pointing to the timeline he'd created, "We treated pet behavior as background noise during welfare checks. Now we know better." He shared how Max's desperate attempts to get help had inspired a whole new set of protocols for emergency responders. The evidence was compelling. In just 1 year, 3 elderly residents had been saved because officers noticed unusual pet behavior during routine patrols. A dog barking differently than usual, a cat scratching persistently at a window. Signals that might once have been ignored now warranted closer investigation. During the lunch break, officers gathered around James to share their own stories. One told of a parakeet whose frantic behavior had alerted neighbors to a gas leak. Another described how a hamster's unusual activity had led to the discovery of an elderly man who had fallen in his garage. The local news had picked up the story, but what touched people most wasn't the program's success, it was how it had started. When reporters interviewed Mrs. Henderson in her apartment, Max sitting proudly beside her, she described those 3 days on the floor. Her voice steady, she explained how Max had kept her hope alive, sharing his food and water, never leaving her side. Back at Pine Grove, the changes were even more dramatic. The building manager had turned the old storage room into a community pet care center. Residents could find everything from pet food to basic medical supplies there. More importantly, it had become a gathering place where people shared advice, stories, and support. The retired carpenter's cat furniture business had taken off. Each piece he created included a small brass plate with Max's paw print, a reminder that every pet deserved a chance to be someone's hero. The proceeds helped cover vet bills for elderly residents who couldn't afford them. Mrs. Henderson had become something of a local celebrity, but she handled the attention with grace. She used her platform to advocate for pet-friendly senior housing and regularly visited the local shelter to help match older cats with elderly residents. Max accompanied her on these visits, seeming to understand his role in helping other cats find homes. The college student who'd switched to veterinary medicine was now doing his internship at the local clinic. He'd started a program providing free basic vet care to seniors' pets, naming it Max's Legacy. The waiting room walls were covered with photos of elderly residents and their animal companions, each pair telling a story of friendship and support. James found himself transformed too. His patrol car trunk now carried emergency pet supplies alongside his regular gear. Fellow officers who'd once teased him about his soft spot for animals now competed to see who could spot potential pet distress signals first. They called it pulling a Max, going above and beyond to make sure no cry for help went unheard. As James wrapped up his presentation, he shared one final photo, a recent shot of Max curled up in Mrs. Henderson's lap as she read stories to children at the local library. Sometimes, he told his fellow officers, the most important training we can get comes from the most unexpected teachers. All we have to do is learn to listen. 2 years after that life-changing night call, Officer James sat in the front row of the community center, watching as Mrs. Henderson cut the ribbon to officially open Max's Haven, the city's first pet-friendly senior living facility. Max perched on her shoulder, his orange fur now sprinkled with white, but his eyes still bright and alert. The building was a testament to how one small act of love could grow into something extraordinary. Each apartment was designed with both elderly residents and their pets in mind. Wide hallways, secure pet doors, and emergency call buttons positioned at both human and animal height were just the beginning. The mayor spoke about how the project had started as a community fundraiser and grown into something nobody could have imagined. Local businesses had jumped in, offering everything from construction materials to ongoing pet care support. The waiting list already stretched into the hundreds. Mrs. Henderson toured visitors through the model apartment, pointing out special features with pride. The kitchen had lower counters where pets could reach their food and water easily. The bathroom included a pet washing station that didn't require bending down. Even the windows had built-in pet perches, complete with sunning spots. The building's community room displayed a wall of photos, elderly residents and their pets who'd been brought together through Max's story. Each pair had their own tale of transformation. A woman who hadn't spoken since losing her husband, now chatting happily with her rescue cat. A man with dementia who remembered to take his medicine because his dog brought him the pill container each morning. James watched as families explored the facility, many accompanied by shelter pets they hoped to adopt. The local animal shelter had set up a special adoption area, carefully matching senior pets with potential owners. They called it speed dating for seniors, and the joy on both human and animal faces made it clear the system worked. The retired carpenter had outdone himself, crafting custom pet furniture for every apartment. Each piece was designed to help both pets and their elderly owners: cat trees with built-in grab bars, dog beds that doubled as footrests, window perches that could support both cat and human for shared sunbathing sessions. As evening approached, residents began moving into their new homes. The hallways filled with the sound of happy chatter, barks, and purrs. Volunteers helped carry boxes and pet supplies, while the building's full-time vet checked in with each new arrival. Mrs. Henderson stood in the courtyard garden, watching as her dream came to life. The space included raised plant beds where residents could garden without bending, water features designed to provide soothing sounds for anxious pets, and plenty of benches for resting and socializing. Max had appointed himself official welcoming committee, greeting each new resident with a friendly meow. He seemed especially gentle with those who arrived alone, as if knowing they needed an extra dose of furry comfort. Several of them left the shelter area with a new companion after meeting him. James thought about how different things might have been if he'd ignored those strange sounds that night, or if Max hadn't been so persistent in getting help. Instead, here they were, watching as hundreds of lives were about to change for the better. As the sun set, Mrs. Henderson gathered everyone in the community room. 2 years ago, she said, her voice strong and clear, I thought my story was ending. Instead, thanks to a brave cat and a caring police officer, it was just beginning. Welcome to your new beginning.